It's a verse talking about Moses. It's a verse that right in the beginning of Moses' story. So it says that Moses had to escape Egypt because he had killed the Egyptian who was oppressing a Jew. So Moses escapes Egypt and goes off to Midian, where he meets his wife Zipporah, and he marries and he becomes a shepherd. So Moses, the first description of Moses as identifying him as a shepherd, which is why the term shepherd, the shepherd of Israel, a shepherd is always considered to be a leader. Why a shepherd? So the Talmud, the Medrash says, because God tests his leaders with sheep. He did it with Moses, and he did it again with King David. Because you see how a human being behaves with sheep, you can know how sensitive they are. And the story goes that as Moses was attending to the sheep of his father-in-law Yisro, so once one of the sheep wandered off, and Moses noticed that a sheep was missing from the flock, which alone is already, thousands of sheep. He noticed one sheep missing. He went looking for it, and he found the sheep a distance away at a brook of water. And Moses realized the sheep was thirsty. So he picked up the sheep after the sheep finished drinking. He picked it up on his shoulders and he carried the sheep back to the flock. And the Medrash concludes that God says, if that's how this man deals with sheep, when no one's watching, who would even notice one sheep in the flock? So sensitive to carry the sheep back, sensitive to its needs, he's a man that I will trust my children with the Jewish people. And hence, that's why Moses is called a shepherd. And you find the word the shepherd in many different places. God is my shepherd. The term shepherd, because it's a metaphor for tending to a flock, being sensitive to their needs. And interestingly, it's not sheep are docile and very timid creatures, and they need protection, and they need someone to nurture and care for them. So it's very much a metaphor for education, a metaphor for taking care of children, and so on. So, just as an aside, they tell the story then that Pavarotti once was doing a rendition, his operatic rendition of Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," and did, of course, a magnificent job. And after he finished, he got a standing ovation in the whole concert hall, the whole auditorium. After a few minutes of the ovation, they sat down, and one man remained standing. It was an old Jew, and the old Jew, when everyone got quiet, suddenly did his rendition of Hashem Roi, which is God is my shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd. And when he finished, the whole place was crying. So Pavarotti, they say, asked the Jew later, why is it when I did my rendition, everybody applauded, and when you did it, they cried? So he said to him in a broken English, he said to him, you may know the psalm, but I know the shepherd. So there's one thing knowing the psalm, the story, and there's another knowing the actual shepherd. So in the continuing story of the shepherd, it continues, it says like this, that then Moses saw a vision. And this is a classic story, but if you think about it, it has very profound meaning. What was the vision that he saw? He saw the burning bush, the classic burning bush. And what was the story? The story goes, he saw a burning bush, and he noticed something very unusual. The bush was burning, but the bush was not being consumed. So the verse continues, that's Exodus 3:2. Then the verse continues in Exodus 3:3, that Moses was very taken by this sight. So he said, let me see what's going over, to behold this remarkable sight. Why doesn't the bush burn? As Moses got closer to the bush, investigating why it's not being consumed, it's burning but not being consumed, God says to Moses, he suddenly hears a voice, and God calls to him from amidst of the bush. He says, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am, Hineni. Very similar, the same expression Abraham uses when God calls him back in his time. And God says to him, do not come closer. Stop where you are. Remove your shoes because you are standing. Remove the shoes from your feet because you're standing at a place that is holy ground. And when Moses did this, God begins to speak to him and tell him, I am the God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And then it says Moses hid his face, since he was afraid to look at God. And then begins ensuing dialogue, where God begins to, for the first time, appoint Moses. He says, I've seen the plight, the suffering of my people, and I want to send you to Egypt to let my people go, to tell Pharaoh to release and redeem these people, to let my people go so they shall serve me. And there's a long dialogue which in itself is fascinating, and I've discussed this in different articles and previous classes, where Moses actually rejects God's offer. He doesn't want to be the leader. He finds all kinds of reasons. He says, I'm not the fitting one, send my older brother Aaron. Then he goes into a whole thing that he cannot speak clearly. He had a speech defect. On and on and on. Moses basically is arguing with God, which in itself is interesting. You know, God comes to you. How often does God come to somebody to have a conversation? And the first thing he gets is no. You know. But I guess they had an interesting relationship. But finally, of course, God prevails. And the story continues. Moses becomes the leader for all the difficulties that he had to face. But it all begins, you know, all great dramatic stories always have a beginning, and the beginning is in these few verses. So the most obvious question is, what's the story with this burning bush? What's the significance of it? You know, what would be missing if we didn't hear this part of the story? You know, Moses comes and God speaks to him and tells him, and they have their argument, or they have their different approaches, and finally Moses gives in to be the leader. What is this, and what is this strange sight? And Moses went to investigate. What did he discover? The Torah never comes back to the story. It doesn't tell us what happened. Why did it not get consumed? And what's the meaning behind it all? And then you have this somewhat cryptic verse that says Moses hides his face. The Talmud actually says that there's another time when Moses asks God to see his face, and God says, no man can see me and live. I will show you my back, but not my face. And the Talmud associates it with this verse, where God says to Moses, when I wanted to show you my face, you hid your face. Now you want to see it, now you won't be able to see it. Which is also a strange Talmud. What is this God getting even? I mean, either he could see or he can't see. So this whole section here, even though it's very fascinating, requires some explanation and significance in the context of the story of Egypt and the oppression and everything else that's going on here with this burning bush. So I want to discuss that. So usually the Torah approach to the thing is you look for comparisons and you look for similar stories elsewhere. Where else do you have stories in the Torah about things burning? So you have another story about for contrast purposes, something that burned but that was consumed. You have a story in the next book in Leviticus where after they constructed the temple, so it says the children of Aaron, their names were Nadav and Avihu, the children of Aaron, because of their great love and yearning and ecstasy, they wanted to have a divine revelation, so they entered into the Holy of Holies. The first day it was constructed. And they entered in, and it says they entered with foreign fire. And it continues, and it says that a fire came out from the altar and consumed them. And they died. So there you have a fire that does consume. Here you have a fire that doesn't consume. So that's one so-called contrasting story. And there the story goes that that reason what happened there, they did not go in any sinful way. They didn't go in with bad intentions. On the contrary, they were so driven to have a divine revelation. They were so driven to have a mystical experience, but they weren't prepared for it. They went in unprepared, and they weren't able to contain it. And as a result, the fire consumed them. It says, Eish Zara. I've given classes on this topic many times, comparing it to people who attempt to try to find spiritual heights through alternative means, foreign substances and stuff like that. Foreign fire, the first burnout in history, is the one when the two sons of Aaron are consumed. So it's an interesting contrast, where here the bush is burning and is not getting consumed. So clearly there's something here that has deeper meaning. What is on a very practical level when you see fire and consuming and so on? It always intrigued me, and you think about some of these great artists and musicians of the last generations, and I'm thinking specifically those in the late 60s. People like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, and even those that may not have died and OD'd, but they blew their brains out. People like Miles Davis and others. Even here we read about Ray Charles and stuff like that. And it's always intriguing how these great geniuses, on one hand, just simply could not really live a normal life, to the point some of them couldn't even live life altogether. And at a young age, they just expired. And so much has been written about this, and it's basically the obvious explanation is, especially when you have a lot of power, you have a lot of intensity, you have a lot of energy inside of you, and you know where to channel it. There's only one way to go. You get to a point where you just simply burn out. And whether the drugs were initially and alcohol were initially methods to try to open up their creative consciousness or creative channels, or whatever it is, or it was a way to relieve their existential anxiety and loneliness. Bottom line is they did not come back to tell about it. And these are contemporary examples. They're not the only examples. You have a similar example with also in the late 60s, the artist Rothko, a Russian Jewish artist who was brilliant, and in the heyday of his career, at the height of his career, he had it wasn't because he had failed or he was lost or depressed. He commits suicide, and till this day, no one really fully understands why. But interesting, I read something from him. Being a Jewish artist, he had exposure. He was dabbled in Jewish mysticism. So I don't know if you're familiar with Rothko's type of art. But he began, like Kandinsky and some other Russian Jewish artists, they began as regular, basically, portrait artists, and then they slowly started what they call deconstructing art, getting to more abstract art, trying to get to the so-called building blocks of what shapes life. And in the case of Rothko, in the late 50s, he began a metamorphosis of his art, to the point where his classic art is those massive paintings of those squares of different shapes and different colors rather. And if you study his the metamorphosis, the evolution of his art, you see that it begins with brighter colors, and as he goes through the 60s, they get darker and darker and darker. It starts more with yellow, reds, and oranges. Then it turns into more green, blue, and purple. Then you get to the point of brown and gray, and then shades of black, and so on. And this is not an accident. It was quite intentional. So I read somewhere, I forgot where, but I'm sure you can find it, that Rothko was very, very, very intrigued by the concept of the Tzimtzum, which I'll explain in a moment, from the Arizal. The Holy Arizal, Isaac Luria, was a great mystic, from the Tzfas mystics in the 16th century, maybe considered the greatest Jewish mystic of all. It was called Isaac Luria, and many students, and basically transformed really Jewish life. But especially the mystical dimension, he's like the final say on mysticism. From him evolved what we call the Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov and all the Hasidic masters were essentially students and students of the Arizal. The Arizal himself, of course, came in a chain of mystics before him, but he began to popularize it to some extent. He began to, I would say, more document it. So you have books like Eitz Chaim, the Book of Life, the Tree of Life. You have many of the writings of the Arizal. Even though he himself didn't write most of it, his student Reb Chaim Vital wrote it. But nevertheless, it was the first real documentation of a Kabbalistic structure. Up to that point, it was left mostly oral transmission, from student to teacher to student, and so on. Or short documents. They have the Zohar, which is a classic, but it was very cryptic. And he essentially opened up Kabbalah, which ultimately today can be understood with Hasidic interpretation as a profound psychological spiritual system. So one of the key concepts of the Arizal, and this is what Rothko was taken by, was also deconstructing existence, except doing it as a mystic does it. And the big dilemma that the Arizal, as many mystics have always struggled with, is the duality of the universe. That if God is an all-encompassing and indivisible reality, how do we have diversity in this world? How do we have duality and plurality? How is it possible to reconcile the two? In other words, can we actually in some way unite with the divine? As mere mortals, finite creatures, with all our flaws and shortcomings, how do we connect to something that is divine, perfect, immortal, and so on. Can the mortal meet the immortal? Or in simple terms, can heaven kiss earth? So long before I mentioned Jimi Hendrix sang about, choose me, he wants to kiss the sky, but he didn't come back to tell about it. This concept was always what intrigued and always was the challenge and the yearning of any spiritual thinking person. How do you connect to that which is beyond? No. And it is a philosophical quandary, a psychological one, on many, many levels. I'm not going to go here into the whole discussion on this topic because it deserves its own class and many classes. But I want to bring it back to what I am addressing here. So the Arizal, based on Zohar, but the Zohar it's more concealed, revealed for the first time the concept what is called the Tzimtzum. What is the Tzimtzum? The Tzimtzum in simple English is called a cosmic black hole. That in some way the divine, what we call the Or Ein Sof, the divine infinite light, was concealed, allowing for the presence and for the emergence of an independent reality. Let me just use an example to make it easier to relate to. Think of a teacher who has an infinite amount of wisdom and profundity, both in depth and length and in width, ideas. If the teacher would just allow himself to, without any filters, allow his ideas to flow, no student would be able to contain it. Would be trying to look at the sun without any shades. So what a teacher needs to do, needs to some way contract, conceal, and most of the ideas, and then allows a small, narrow ray of transmission to spoon feed and to allow the student to digest the ideas. And as the student's containers expand, meaning as the student's mind and heart and soul expand to contain more, the ideas begin to flow until a point where the student can become as great as the teacher. But if you don't conceal most of the ideas, you'll never be able to teach a child. You have to teach a child first A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or Aleph Beis. In the A, B, C, you don't see any wisdom. All you see is letters. But there's no wisdom possible, no language. No ideas are possible without language. So you begin by just teaching a child very, very small bite-sized pieces that a child can contain. Similar to the fact that the rain is healthy only when it falls as raindrops, not when it floods the fields. It has to come raindrops that are absorbed by the earth, and then more raindrops can fall. So the Arizal explains that there was this quantum leap where the divine infinite light concealed itself consciously, allowing for each of us to emerge as independent realities. So that's why we can sit here, and each of us thinks we are an independent existence. When in truth, we are really part of one higher reality. This today, it does not require mysticism even to relate to this. This is basic quantum mechanics, actually. The ideas, of string theory or other theories trying to explain existence, trying to explain phenomenon, and how is it possible that subatomic particles can sense each other billions of miles away from each other, faster than the speed of light. So one of the theories is that there's a type of invisible quilt. It's not my words, these are words from physicists. A visible like blanket that all of existence rests upon. So this one blanket, it's one quilt, one tapestry. And we are like small pieces on this tapestry. So think of if we were all sitting on an invisible blanket, you're one piece, I'm another piece, this table's another. We sense consciously ourselves only as one little piece, but in truth it's one long big field of energy, which was an issue and a challenge that the Arizal and others always struggled with. How is it possible, if we are truly part of one in inherent reality, how is it possible that we can hurt each other? Is it conceivable that if a person does something wrong with their right hand, that the left hand will hit the right hand? That's considered a disease if the body attacks itself. So if we are all part of one higher reality, how is it possible that we can hurt each other? How is it possible to be selfish, to narcissistic? The answer is we don't see it. We're blind. We only see our little myopic view. We only see things on our little farm, our little reality. And even there we know very little. We don't sense existence as a field of energy, as some type of unified entity. We see pieces, we see particles, when in truth it's like a wave. Now, in Kabbalistic terms, the objective is that that's exactly what God wanted. God concealed the unifying wave in order for us to each feel like particles, and in order for us to have the wisdom to retrace the steps and reconnect to that quilt, so to speak. And that takes work. That takes effort, that takes discipline, that takes introspection to come from a selfish, self-absorbed creature to realize that you're one piece of a large, big puzzle. And there's a bigger reality than you. It's not all about you. But it all begins is every morning we wake up, we begin with it's about me. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that. I need this, I need that. And we negotiate. You know, if we need something from someone, we may give because we get something in return. But it's all about me. I'm at the center. And then there are people who even have developed compassion into an art or a science. And it's also just another way of making sure you get what you need. When the truth is, the ultimate goal is, of course, to realize that, yes, you're indispensable and you're necessary, but you're one musical note among a large composition of music where each note needs everyone else. And everyone needs us. So we're like one large composition. So the particles are real. The individuality that we have is real. What's false is to think that there's no connection between one and the next. Now, of course, if every person on earth, 7 billion people on earth, realized they were musical notes of one large composition, we'd have all our problems solved. You know, there would not be you and I, us and them, whether it's an economy or a war, or all the differences that people that turn into real battles and real chaos and so on and so forth. So in a way, the root of all problems begins with that delusion that you are it. You think you're the center of the universe and everything else is there to serve you. And if someone takes a little piece away from you, you are offended and you want vengeance. And if you think that this, and there's all the wars that come out of envy or greed, all the vices are rooted in this issue. The lack of sensing the underlying unity of all of existence. So the Arizal solves this dilemma by explaining the Tzimtzum, that it's God that concealed that unity, concealed the divine unifying light, allowing us to only see a little part. And this was this big black hole called the Tzimtzum. So if you deconstruct existence from the bottom up, you will reach a Tzimtzum. You will reach a place where one big black hole. And Rothko came to that point, and that's where he completely lost it, and he committed suicide. So I didn't know him, and I'm not going to speculate, but I will say that I submit possibility that he hit the black hole, and that's where he was unable to continue. And he burned out. Success didn't make a difference, money didn't make a difference, he was unable to go further, and that's where it all became black. So it began with bright colors and it turned into black until the point of his total blackness. So, being that he studied at Tzimtzum, that's what I believe, that's what happened to him. The problem was that had he come to a class of Chassidus, he would have realized that Tzimtzum is not where it ends. As impenetrable as the Tzimtzum may be, that it's not airtight. There are glimpses, there are glimmers of light that emerge through the Tzimtzum that allow us back to the light and the unity before the Tzimtzum. And I also submit, though I will not suggest that Hendricks and these guys all learned the Kabbalah, and that's what but they all came to the same problem. And very similar, I don't know if to say lahavdil or not, to what happened to the children of Aaron. How do you contain unbelievable power of light? If you can't contain it, well, one or two things has to happen. Either you get burned out or the light has to be given up. So what you have is, there's some say there's a very thin line between madness and genius. And some even say that actually sanity is really a form of blindness. If you read the William Blake and the classic line, which actually became the name of Jim Morrison's group, The Doors, that when you cleanse the doors of perception, all you're left is what is really there. Everything is infinite. These ideas are literally almost word for word texts from Zohar and other classic Kabbalistic texts. In other words, the reality behind the curtain, the one we don't see, is of a completely other form. And if you try to go there, it can be very dangerous. It can be very intriguing. So you have stories in the Talmud. You have the classic story, just like Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, entered into the Holy of Holies, and what happened? They got burned out, literally. You have another classic story, which you may have heard of, the story of the 4 sages who entered into the Pardes. The word Pardes is a Hebrew word that means orchard. Pardes, the garden, the orchard. Pardes is also an acronym for 4 Hebrew words. It consists of 4 letters: Pei, Reish, Daled, and Samach. They consist of the 4 different methods of interpretation of Torah. There's Pshat, that's the Pei, which is literal interpretation. There's the Reish, which is Remez, allegorical interpretation. There's the Daled, which is Drush. It's homiletic, Talmudic, legal interpretation. And the final 4th one is Samach, Sod, the secret, the esoteric, the mystical interpretation. So Pardes, whenever you talk about people entering the orchard, you're really talking about people having a mystical experience, spiritual experience. And the story in the Talmud, which is so intriguing as well, these 4 enter: Ben Azai, Ben Zoima, Ben Sheshes rather, a man called Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. And what happens to them? 4 different things happen. One of them, Ben Azai, dies, completely blown away by the experience, and he physically dies. Expires, his soul expires. Similar to what happened to the children of Aaron. The second one, Ben Sheshes, he goes mad, insane. The third one is named Elisha ben Avuya, one of the greatest sages. He becomes a non-believer, an apostate, to the point that the Talmud from there on refuses to call him by name. They call him Acher, the other. It's almost like a dismissive name, the other. But he remains a great sage, and he has students who still come to study with him with the justification. They say, we go to him to get the fruit, and we throw away the peel, because he remained a great scholar. And the 4th one, Rabbi Akiva, says the only one, the words are Nichnas b'shalom v'yatzu b'shalom. He entered in peace, b'shalom, in peace, and exited, yatzu b'shalom, and left in peace. The only one that came out intact. And shalom, as you know, peace in Hebrew is not just absence of war. Peace is wholesomeness. Peace is completion. It also means shalom from the word complete. He was a complete individual. So of course everyone wants to understand what was the difference between these 4. The other 3, they all went in with the same intention. They all were great men. They were all great sages. It wasn't like there was some problem. And yet the effect was so different. So I want to just talk about, obviously each one of them can be analyzed, but talk about this, the one that became insane. Which is another form. One died, one became insane. They both were unable to contain the experience. So I remember reading, and it was very fascinating to me. There was a book called, what was it called? Storming Heavens or Raging Heavens. It was a book in like maybe 15 years ago. It came out, maybe more. Who knows? Time flies. And it was the subtitle of the book was America's Romance with LSD, which for those of you not familiar with what that is, it's not an acronym for Let's Start Davening. Okay? So it was an interesting book, and I remember reading there that the pharmaceutical researcher Albert Hoffman, who died last year, who basically discovered LSD in a laboratory, Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland. Now he was looking actually for for some type of chemical to induce a state of madness. He was looking for something that psychiatrists and doctors could use to somewhat relate to people who are just simply in a different world. What was then called madness. Today they have other names for it. The Jews call it meshuggah, but in those days they called it madness. Today we have kinds of chemical imbalances. And the word madness is not used really, or crazy, or things like that, because that's just meaningless words, as we shall see. So he was looking for some type of simulation of madness, so people can see whether a researcher, a doctor, can go into a state that would be called a madness, be able to relate to someone in that state. And he experimented, of course, on himself, because no one else was going to volunteer for this. So he had, in his experiments, what he did was, wherever he was, both at home and in his laboratory, he would have always a tape recorder ready, and a notepad. So in case anything happened to him, he could record it, even though he may never come back to tell about it. So he had this. Anyway, the story goes, and this is documented there. And today it's well known that he was one day taking something and ingesting some new concoction, and he was going home for lunch on a bicycle. So the ride of his bicycle from his lab to his home was through a beautiful meadow that was with many hedges on both sides. In Switzerland, have these beautifully they call them groomed meadows. And he was driving on his bicycle, and while he was riding, something started happening to him, as he documents. He started feeling like some strange sensations, and then he describes that his bicycle felt like it started like going off, like taking off, and he started seeing the hedges begin to vibrate, and then the colors in the skies, and everything started becoming psychedelic, and he had what's called the first psychedelic experience with a artificial chemical, and he finally got home, and he thought he was going crazy. So he immediately turned on the tape recorder, began to jot notes, and then he passed out at some point. But he did come back. And he told the story. And this was the beginnings of what's called LSD. At that point, it was an experimental drug. It was illegal in the United States till 66, I think, or 65. And there was even people, students at Berkeley and others that were volunteers for the experiments that different technicians and researchers were doing. But the interesting thing that I recall reading, which was fascinating to me, not so much the experience, was more the parallel to something that is absolutely straight from Eitz Chaim, straight from the Arizal's writings. And that is, he described, based on his experience and based on, I guess, subsequent experiments, he described the state of madness as being one, and again, I don't remember if these are exact words or it's my analogy, I don't remember, I'm not sure, was essentially where the channels of your mind begin to open up, and therefore, you lose sight of the distinction between things, and therefore there's a flow, an overwhelming flow of a supersensory experience. So the analogy that I always use, and I said again, maybe I don't think it's his analogy, was think of it like a reservoir of water. You have a big reservoir of water, and that water, how does it reach our homes, our offices, our lives? So that reservoir of water collects the water like a pool. There are major arteries that connect the reservoir to the cities. Let's say to New York, upstate reservoirs. Those arteries connect to water mains. Those water mains become pipes that enter your home, and you have a sink or a shower or bathtub, and you have a faucet. You turn on the faucet, and you're able to regulate the flow in a very controlled way. So what you're really doing is it's a flow coming from a very wide reservoir. So think of the reservoir as the state of the unconscious. And the flow is the conscious. So where does our consciousness come from? So the way the Kabbalists put it, that the consciousness comes from is a very blinded and narrow state of awareness based on an unconscious state which sees it all. However, if that unconscious state, think of a faucet that breaks. What will happen? It'll flood your house. It'll flood your sink. You won't be able to drink water. So it's critical to have filters and to have regulators that allow the flow to come in drop by drop, or at some regulated way that you can contain it. If the unconscious, if the so-called chemicals in the brain melt down, the compartments melt down, when you have such a flow from the unconscious, you'll basically go insane. So if you think of it that way, insanity is actually closer to reality than sanity is. Sanity is a form of blindness. Sanity is limited flow of intelligence. But it's necessary for us to function. You open up those channels, you burn out. There's no way to contain it. So madness and genius are very closely connected. A genius is essentially a person who has the channels almost to capacity opened, so there's a very serious flow, but not to the point where the whole faucet breaks and then the person can't control the flow. And you'll find many geniuses fluctuate between madness and genius. I'm sure you've met some people like that. Or maybe some of you are that way. Some of us. And so it's interesting, the twist here is that a person like that may be much closer to the truth than so-called the sane, conscious person who has it all controlled and all figured out. So essentially, when we say they're chemical imbalance, let's take, for example, a state of paranoia, extreme paranoia. A person, for example, who's taken and constantly in fear, and they may have had a traumatic experience that triggered it. But we all have had traumatic experiences in our lives. Why doesn't it destroy our life? Or hopefully doesn't. Is because we have a brain that regulates everything. And after a while, I lost my father, I can't say lost, my father passed away 6.5 years ago. Of course, the moment of shock of death and the early months and so on are very overwhelming. And I remember it like today. But then something happens. The curtain closes, so to speak. So I can still evoke those memories, but it's not with the same intensity. What the mind does is, it puts it in its closet. So of course you can retrieve it and you can go back to that experience, but it's not quite like the shock. But if our memories did not fade, we would be completely consumed with certain experiences and never be able to get beyond any trauma or any shock in our lives. So in a way, the memory loss and things moving away from something, in a sense, in other words, not experiencing it with the same intensity as we did in its initial state, is actually a blessing. Even though the blessing is predicated on a certain type of forgetfulness, a certain type of closing of the door. So what a healthy brain does is, it's like the faucets. It creates compartments, so if something negative happens, okay, at some point you move on, it's still part of you. For a person who's completely still there, they can't see anything else. That's why you'll find someone who's in a very depressed state and say, well, you also have good things in your life. Why is depression dominating your life? But they can't compartmentalize. Right now, that compartment is, the chambers are open, there's no chemicals controlling it and confining it, essentially. Unconfined, it takes over your life. Every obsession is that way. Every obsession, like a fire that completely consumes you. And that's exactly what happened to the sons of Aaron, and that's what happened to the three others besides Rabbi Akiva. They were consumed. So one was consumed through death, one was consumed through madness, another was consumed through doubt and confusion. And Rabbi Akiva knew some secret. What was the secret that Rabbi Akiva knew? That even the children of Aaron didn't know. And the other three sages didn't know. And that is the answer to this story. A flame that does not consume. That was what Moses, the great Moses, was struggling with, and was extremely relevant to the entire chapter of the story of Egypt. How do you experience something that is so powerful and so truth, without being destroyed by it, without being consumed? And you see through history, very few are able to do that. Very few are able to remain standing with their eyes open and see the naked truth, the blind naked truth. Very difficult. Even though you ask most people, would you like to hear the truth about yourself, about things, everybody would say, of course, I can hear anything. I've got the ability to hear it all. I haven't met very many people like that, actually. I know people who say it, but I don't think any of us, I include myself, can really bear to see everything. Denial has its benefits. One of the benefits is that you're able to contain certain truths. It's not easy to just suddenly see yourself naked with all your strengths and with all your weaknesses. It could be overwhelming. There's the classic story of that man, all his life was searching for the truth. He traveled all over the world, one place to the next, went to gurus, to rabbis, to priests, to everybody, to try to find the truth. Now, at this point, he was at the end of his life, but he never gave up, and he never really found what he was looking for. But one day, he meets this sage, this aging, elderly sage, and he realizes this man is definitely a pious man. So he tells him about his story, that I've been searching my entire life for truth. So this man, the sage, says to him, what kind of price are you willing to pay? He says, what do you mean? My whole life, nothing has been more important to me than this. I'm willing to pay any price, anything, to find the real truth of reality. So the sage says, okay, I'll tell you where to go, and here you'll find it. And he gives them directions to go to a certain distant land, a certain place. He sets off on a journey, and excited, anticipating that maybe this is going to be it. And his entire life journey was worth it. Anyway, he finally comes to this place somewhere deep, some foreign country, deep in the woods, away from any civilization. He sees from a distance, he sees this enormous building, this enormous palace, which seemed odd, didn't belong there. So he gets closer, he comes in, walks in, and this most awesome sight. There's long chambers. The only thing he sees in these chambers is bright light. Everywhere along the line are hundreds, thousands of flames burning, of different sizes and shapes. And as he's taken by the sight, suddenly a man comes over to him and says, "What can I do for you?" So he says, "This and this sage sent me here." He says, and he told me I can find the truth there. So he says, "Yes, this is called the House of Truth. This is called the Olam HaEmes. This is called the Beis HaEmes, the House of Truth." And he says, and these flames that you see here is the true story of each person's life. Every person on earth has a flame in this room. And you get closer to a flame, you can observe it, and you can see the person's life in that flame. The reality, not the camouflage, and not the masks, and not all the charades, the reality of each person's life. He says, those big flames you see that are just beginning to burn, these are newborn children who have just come to life. So they have big flame burning, a lot of oil, and so on. And those flames that are about to burn out are people who's about to finish their lives on this earth. So of course, this man tentatively assessed him, and where can I see my flame? So he tells him, go down row so-and-so, number this and this, your flame is right over there. So you can imagine he very slowly makes his way there. First time he's going to see himself face to face, to his flame, his real story. And as he gets closer, he's looking, he's somewhat taken aback. He sees the flame is about to burn out. He realizes that means that he's about to come to the end of his life. So he looks around quickly, loses all his presence, and his panic, he takes another flame which has a lot of oil and pours it into his and suddenly, as he's doing it, he senses the stare, the peering eyes of the overseer, the caretaker of this house of truth, who's looking at him and says to him, "So you're ready to pay any price for the truth, right?" So in other words, as the analogy goes, when push came to shove, when he saw his life was about to end, suddenly all his search for truth went out the window. He didn't accept it. He thought he can get away by faking and putting in a piece more oil when it wasn't his to take. Now, the story is told by Hasidim as an example where people can be dedicated to searching the truth, but put them to the test, and not necessarily. They suddenly hear a truth they don't like, they may not suddenly say, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm embracing it." So for Moses, the great challenge was, can you see this connection? Can you see God and still remain a human being and maintain your individuality? And this is a question that has so many different implications. You could even apply it to our lives today. Look at some of the great radical atheists. Look at one of their main arguments against God. They have Christopher Hitchens, Olav Shalom, God is not great, or Sam Harris, or Richard Dawkins. And they are basically almost as fundamentalist as the people they're criticizing. They're fanatics, atheist fanatics, and they rave against religion. And one of their critiques is that you see religion and its passion has brought a lot of destruction to this world. Some of them make arguments more destruction than anyone else. I don't know about that. Hitler and Stalin weren't exactly religious, but however, they do make the argument of religious wars. And we see it today. Look in the Middle East. You look at terrorism in the name of God. We're not talking about criminals who are trying to rob a bank or steal something. In the name of God, are ready to kill themselves and kill others. So if you're an outsider, an objective outsider, so to speak, I don't know if there's such a thing, but you say, look at religion. Religion is this, people in the name of God are ready to kill. What kind of God is this? What kind of religion is this? And then you look at the history of religion, especially in the last few thousand years, until basically 200-300 years ago, In the Western world, the church dominated, and it was basically terrorized all its subjects. Everyone has the classic story of Galileo having to recant his ideas because it was going against the church's doctrine. In other words, the battle, what we call between science and religion, between faith and reason, which began a few hundred years ago, was a backlash, and maybe a healthy backlash, against an abusive and a corrupt religion that was using God as an excuse to claim authority. And this still haunts us till this day. At the same time, you see, religion has now gone away. Faith is still there. So some make the argument, faith, it's too risky. Once you bring God into the picture, people start thinking they have absolute monopoly on truth. And God, basically, they burn everything up around them. They're intolerant. Religion and intolerance are almost synonymous in most people's secular minds. And for good reason. You see it all the time. Recently we have all this embarrassing news coming out of cities in Israel of how so-called fundamentalist Jews behaving in very, very embarrassing ways to their neighbors. And I, for one, I'm embarrassed by these things because one of the hardest challenges I have to deal with is, of course, I'm stereotyped as well like that. I'm a beard and a yarmulke, so I must be one of these guys that spits and throws rocks at others. So it's not a simple matter to deal with, and it creates the impression, unfortunately, that that's what religion is about. So it is. It's religion basically consumes its inhabitants. It consumes those that come near it. And that obviously is definitely not what Moses or what God really wants. So that's one manifestation of it. And then, as I mentioned before, the other manifestation, as we see these musical geniuses and others who come to points of recognizing, touching deeper truths, and they do not have the capacity, or as the Kabbalists say, the containers, to come back and tell about it. And they burn out, as did the students of the children of Aaron, as did the three other sages who entered into the Pardes. And Moses was struggling with this dilemma from the beginning of his life. And the relevance of it here is critical, the relevance of it. And that will lead us, of course, to what the secret is. What is Rabbi Akiva's secret? And what did Moses discover? Why the Torah doesn't tell us what happened, actually. So you'll see, if you really read closely, it does tell us that the dilemma was resolved. So Moses is struggling with this thing. He sees a fire burning, a burning bush, and it's not being consumed. It's opposite of nature. Things that burn get consumed. You have a piece of wood or any other fuel that's ignited and lit. It may take time, but that fuel will run out. That wood will burn out, and unless you add more fuel, the matter will turn into energy. So what Moses was struggling with is, how do you see something here is matter, remains matter, is burning, and it's not being consumed? And why was he seeing it? Because this was both a philosophical and personal and psychological dilemma that Moses was struggling with. So let's go back a moment to the story of the bush. The bush was a thorn bush. A sneh in Hebrew is a thorn bush. It's considered to be the lowliest of all vegetation. A thorn bush. Thorn bushes grow in the most parched land. They don't bear fruit. And they're considered to be always symbols of pain. Thorns are always a symbol of pain, not a symbol of beauty. So the Medrash asks the question, the first time God appears to Moses, why does he appear to him in a thorn bush? Why doesn't he appear to him in a beautiful tree? An apple tree, a willow. We have all kinds of nice, mighty oak tree. There are all kinds of trees to appear. So it's true, this was a wilderness in the desert, but hey, listen, since miracles are happening anyway. So why does he appear to him in a thorn bush? And the Medrash has a fascinating answer, because God and Moses understood each other, and God anticipated Moses' biggest question, which was, you're coming to tell me to go to the people and tell them they should have hope, and that they will be redeemed one day from their oppression. So I want to know one thing, and they will want to know one thing. Are you God with us only in beauty, or are you with us in pain and in our loneliness? The big question that we all ask when people are suffering and feel alone, and feel things are not working, the biggest question, where is God? Why isn't God here to help me now? And sometimes the way it's phrased is that God only appears when there's beautiful things. And Moses was wondering that. Maybe you're a God that only appears where it's beautiful, with His light, but with His darkness, with His loneliness, with His pain, you disappear. So God, in anticipating that, and that's what the Medrash says, I will appear in a thorn bush, not in a beautiful bush. To answer that question to Moses, to tell him, no, I am here with you in your void. I am here with you in your suffering. And though you may not feel that I'm there, I'm still there with you. Your work is to figure out how to meet me there. But I'm there with you. That classic greeting card, those two sets of footprints in the sand that describe the journey of life. And the person says, he sees the footprints, and sees two sets of footprints. And whenever he had a state of despair or loss, he sees only one set of footprints. And these two sets is God and you traveling through life. So the man asked God, why is it that whenever I was in trouble, I only see one set of footprints? Why did you forsake me then? And God said, I didn't forsake you. Those are my footprints. I was carrying you. So when we are in darkness, when we are suffering, we are blinded. That is essentially, if you want to visualize loneliness, visualize fear, visualize despair, it's a sense of isolation and a sense of blindness. We don't see clearly. That's how it is. It blinds us. That's how powerful it is. And it blinds us. We don't know what strengths we have. That's what makes it so difficult. If we knew what strengths we had, then if we were in a situation where things are difficult, you use your strengths and you get yourself out of the situation. The secondary problem is that fear paralyzes us. Darkness paralyzes us to think, deceive us into thinking you don't have the power to get out of this. And that's far worse than the initial problem. So they say, as Yudias Hamachla, the awareness of a problem is half the cure. But if you don't think you have a problem, or you feel completely powerless, it's very difficult to get out of that. That's why you find Jeremiah, when he describes in the book of Lamentations, it's the saddest book in the Bible, in the Torah. It's the book that we read on the night of Tisha B'Av, the saddest night in the Hebrew calendar. So it says there, it begins by Eicha Yashva Badad. Woe, he says, alas, she sits alone. That's how he opens up the entire book. Now who's the she? He's talking about Jerusalem. That Jerusalem, woe to Jerusalem, she sits all alone. And the obvious question is, of all things, that's how he opens up the book. The holy temple is being destroyed in flames. The people are being massacred. Beginning a long exile that would just bring oppression after oppression. And of all things, Jeremiah begins, what bothers him is the loneliness. And if you think about it, that's exactly the issue. Because if we didn't feel so alone in our pain, we'd be able to get out of it. Pain makes you feel isolated. You feel no one's there with you. That when things are going well, people are around, but nobody wants to be with you when you're in despair. And nobody can really get you when you're in that place. And it's the loneliness that is ultimately the most debilitating factor. It may not be the worst part of the experience, but it's the worst element of it. Because the loneliness means that you don't feel there's anyone that can help you. You don't feel that anyone cares. And that's the question we ask: does anyone care about me? That's what we ask when things are not working well. So God appears to Moses in a thorn bush. Says, not only do I care, I'm with you in the thorn bush. Again, here is not the place to discuss how God appears in darkness when you can't see Him. But suffice it to say, there's long discussions of how sometimes something exists inside of you, even though you absolutely don't see it. And sometimes it's more intense actually when you don't see it than when you do. So this leads now to the next stage. What Moses was struggling with was obviously the issue of evil. The issue of a Holocaust. Where is God in the Holocaust? Where is a good God in all this darkness in our lives? And Moses was wondering about these questions, not just for himself, but for generations to come, which is why it's all documented. So the first question was, is God there? And the second question is, can we contain God? That's the question. And that's the issue of the burning bush. Can you contain these forces and not be consumed? And this is a dilemma, as I said, a philosophical one. The mystics have always wondered. Because if you can say, one second, if there's an expression in some of the Jewish philosophers, they say, can you know God? And one of them answers, if I knew him, I would be him. You know? If I knew him, I would be him. Which means, essentially, you can argue, you and God cannot coexist. If you want to be with God, you have to give up your individuality. You may get something much greater in return, but it's not you any longer. Or if you want to be you, you're going to have some concealed form of God. Which is really a question also, if you think about it, about relationships. Can two people who are distinct individuals, both with their strengths, and I'm talking about healthy, not where one is annihilated by the presence of another, can two people, two independent circles, join as one, maintain their individuality, and have absolute seamless love for each other? It would seem impossible. Or logic would dictate it's impossible. Because how could two people, they have different interests, they come from different backgrounds, they will have disagreements. So you could see love is a form of compromise. Because we love each other. I give in a little, you give in. But can we maintain a fierce individuality and independence and still be one with another? This is a dilemma. And you'll find in Jewish mysticism, you'll find different opinions. Some say, you want your individuality, you can't have the full experience of the other. Some say you want the experience of the other, you can't have your complete individuality. And ultimately, the Arizal and the mystics that come after him, especially in Hasidic thought, go on to an entire discussion of how you can have both, the best of both worlds. But there's a secret ingredient to get there. Because it doesn't seem logical. How could I have individuality and completely join another human being? And all this is what Moses was struggling with, and all this is what the tree that burns and doesn't get consumed is about. It means you can burn with passion and not hurt yourself and hurt others. Is that possible? You know, many people will describe their lives. You know, when I was younger and more energetic and wilder, I had a fiery revolutionary spirit, and it was great, but I ended up hurting myself and hurting others. I came to realize that the only way to really live is I have to give up some of my passion. Because the fires of passion, unbridled, untempered, will destroy me or others. And logic would, as I said, seems to support that. But here, the vision of Moses was, no, it's not. It's not correct. It doesn't have to be that way. And Judaism is built on the principle that it's absolutely not that way. But here's the secret answer. If you read the next verse, so it says that Moses went to see this site. He wanted to see, how does this happen? How does something burn and not be consumed? And as I mentioned, in history, you find everybody that burned too much got consumed. Or they stopped burning, or they had to slow down their burning if they weren't going to get consumed. As I said, if the faucet breaks or tears open, the flow is too much, it's overwhelming. So it says that God says to Moses, Moses, Moses. And he says, here I am. He says, don't go continue because you're walking on sacred ground. And he says, remove your shoes from your feet because it's sacred ground. Then Moses hides his face. What is the meaning of this statement here? Basically, it was like this. Moses was intrigued by this sight, and God was reminding him that if you ever want to be able to reconcile and burn with passion and not be consumed, you can't be driven by your self-interest. Even your interest in discovering what the mystery is behind this paradox. And that's when Moses says, here I am, which means he recognizes that he's not here just for his own selfish gain, but he's here to serve God, serve a higher calling. And Moses takes off his shoes, which is symbolic of giving up some of your needs, a certain humility. That humility is the secret ingredient to enter the Holy of Holies and not get burned. And it's only those people that were humble in that experience that were able to combine the two. And that's why Moses hides his face. So that is exactly the answer. That's exactly the response to what Moses was coming to discover. He found his answer. That's why he doesn't continue asking God How is this bush not being burned? So let's explain this for a moment. Humility. The problem with the sons of Aaron was they were not driven for any negative or evil interests. They weren't trying to make money. It wasn't about their honor. They were very passionate souls who said, hey, here's an experience. I can enter into the Holy of Holies. I can experience a moment of spiritual ecstasy, unprecedented. The problem was there was too much of the I could experience. I want it. And the key secret is, as you want it too much, then it's on your terms. And if it's on your terms, that's where it cannot coexist with God. As soon as you recognize that it's not about you, and doesn't begin with you, and you're able to give up that you, that's when you can coexist. Now the interesting thing, that doesn't mean you're giving up your individuality. It means you're giving up your self-contained sense of fulfillment. And here's the interesting thing. Remember, I referred to this earlier. Later on, Moses asked God to show me your face. This was in a moment of intimacy, literally intimacy with God, where Moses is praying for the people because they had built a golden calf. It's also bad times. And he elicits from God the deepest secrets of compassion. It's called the 13 divine attributes of compassion, which we invoke every Yom Kippur. God reveals to him the secret of how to awaken compassion in me when all else seems to fail. It's a pretty powerful thing. God is saying, here's the secret. Call these names, say these words, say them with your heart, and I will hear you. So at that moment, Moses has a desire. His desire is, I want to see your face. No one has ever seen God's face. So he says, show me your glory, show me your face. And God says the immortal words that I mentioned earlier, no man can see my face and live. But listen to the end of the story. So God then comes back to Moses and says, you know what, I will show you my back, but my face you will not see. So the question is asked, why does God have to rub it in? He already told him no man can see me and live. So he says, okay, I will show you my back. Why does he have to say, but my face you will not see? As if to make it very clear, my face you will not see. And another question is this: Moses was what could call one of the wisest men, maybe the wisest of all. He understood what he needed God to tell him, you can't see my face and live. Well, why did he ask? And why are we told that he asked when he was rejected? So one of the commentaries explains it in a fascinating way. I won't discuss this here. It says the way you're supposed to read the verse is as follows. And then I'll explain it in more palatable terms. I hope this is not getting too mystical here. And that is, God says to Moses, I will show you my back and my face. That's how you should read it. But my face you will see by not looking. So instead of reading, I will show you my back and my face you will not see, the read is, I will show you my back and my face, but my face you will see by not looking. Which means there are two ways to experience a real, true experience. We call one is interpolation, one is extrapolation. One is direct sight. You see something, and you can describe what you see. Another, you see it through its reflection, through its, through process of elimination. I'll just use an example. No one has ever seen the unconscious. That's why it's called unconscious. And if someone has seen it, usually, as I mentioned, will probably be someone that's more mad than sane. Yet, we have people who claim to be experts on the unconscious. And you go to therapy. Okay, I'm not saying all therapists are good, but let's say some are good. What can they see in you that you don't see in yourself? And what can they see in the forces, the trained eye? What do they see and how can they see it? If the unconscious remains behind the curtain, how do we ever see the unconscious? So here's an example. I'll just give you an example. Imagine an imaginary wall that's shrouded in darkness. You cannot see the wall, but you know there's a wall there. You cannot go over and touch it, and you can't shine a light on it. Is there any way for you ever to figure out what this wall looks like? Is it a straight wall? Is it a jagged wall? Is it bent? What kind of wall is it? So yes, there is one way. You have a ball and you bounce it against the wall. And what you see, you don't see the wall, you see how it bounces back. If it bounces back straight, you know that part of the wall is straight. If it bounces back to the right, you know that part of the wall is jacked to the left. And you keep bouncing it enough times, you can get almost a real image of the wall without ever touching it, seeing it, through its reaction. A trained person who understands psychological forces, especially the unconscious, in a way, just like when you go to a doctor, and the doctor says, okay, I have a pain in my hand, God forbid. So he starts touching, pulling, okay, does it hurt, does it hurt, does it hurt? So he starts getting to the more sensitive area. So you know there's a nerve or whatever it is, and that way, it's not like you can actually see it, but by process of elimination, you see how you react. In a conversation, this is also true. Someone who's trained and really knows how to do this will have a conversation with you, and will ask questions. And you'll think they're just innocent questions, but the way you answer, and the way you resist answering, and the things you avoid going to, is clear sign there's something there. So you're not seeing the unconscious, but you're bouncing a ball off of it. And very often that's the case. Exactly where somebody doesn't want to talk about that, so usually where the problem is, of course. Because the nerve is raw there. You don't want to go there. It's too tender. And it's not because you're being secretive, or it's just like a reaction. It's a knee-jerk reaction. So you can never see the unconscious, but you can see it by not looking. And this is the secret to true relationships and everything. One of the things, we live in a society that is driven by acquisition. You want something, you want to own it. You want to acquire it. You want to possess it. We don't appreciate, and we're not trained to think in terms of truths that emerge, that you cannot acquire. Money can't buy it. It's not a cliche. Money cannot buy love. Love emerges. Truth emerges. God emerges. Everything real truly emerges. Cannot be bought. So we're trained to think, I can just go and get it. Here are 10 steps. Secrets to love. 20 steps, the secret to efficiency. And so on. The reason these books still remain on the bestseller list is obviously they're not working, or else no one would buy any more. Why would you buy another one? But it's the aspiration, Like someone told me, the journey, the destination is the journey, is the seeking out. Not necessarily you're ever going to get what you want, but the art of acquiring of emerging things is not something that we are trained, because it's much more subtle. And it requires a tool that our society does not cherish. It's called the tool of humility. It's the tool of restraint. It's the tool of silence. You want to hear truths, you have to know how to be silent. You have to listen well. You want to hear music, you can't allow the rush hour and other extraterrestrial, extracurricular noises drown out the sounds. Every one of us has a sound. You listen to someone that you love or you care about, there are words that they won't say, but if you are able to go away, if you're able to get rid of yourself, put yourself aside, you're able to suspend yourself, you can hear other sounds. People who listen well are able to suspend themselves. All those that suspend themselves can see deeper truths. But this is something that is not taught in school, because school we're taught, here are the instruments, here are the tools, go and use them, and be aggressive, because if you don't do it, no one's going to do it for you. That may be all good in material things. Nothing that is energy related or spiritual related can be experienced that way. And that's what Moses saw. He saw matter burning. The bush was burning, and it was not being consumed. So he was wondering, matter is consumed. Matter turns into energy. But here it wasn't being consumed. How is that possible? The answer is, once you experience bittul, that Hebrew word, the only thing that can disappear, that can be consumed, is something that's not consumed with itself. As soon as you are an ego or an entity, just like you were born, you can die. What cannot die? Something that wasn't born. Selflessness cannot disappear, because the more it disappears, the more powerful it becomes. You see? So when a person is not defined, does not define themselves by their presence, but they define themselves by their lack of presence, that can never be taken from them. Those are the people that live on forever. Anyone that builds monuments for themselves and makes a big name for themselves, there comes a point where that name will die, where their presence will die, where their influence will die. And when they're dead, some people will be even happy that they're not here anymore, because their power was only there when they wielded it. And then there are people who are here that we can talk about here, Moses, almost 3,500 years ago, 3,300 years ago. And we talk about him as if he's here, because he was never taken by himself. He was what's called the humblest man that ever walked on earth. And it was the humility. It was then that you're able to see that which you cannot see when you go with your presence. So interestingly, when we talk about faith and reason, some people think faith is absence of reason. You know, when all else fails, okay, I have some faith, it's my crutch, I rely on it. Maybe faith is not the absence of reason. Maybe faith is the door that you enter after reason. Reason brings you to certain steps. Informed faith is not the faith of a child that has no reason. Informed faith is the faith that comes after reason. When a person falls in love with someone and they decide to marry, they decide to commit the rest of their lives to this person, is this an act of reason? Is this a logical thing to do? There's always risks. There's always risks. So what is really going on? What's going on is that your reason leads you to a place that this person seems to be the right person, but there's always a door you have to enter. And I won't necessarily call it purely faith. It could be intuition, it could be a sense, but there is a risk, because if you want to take no risks, you're not going to make any commitments in your life. That's it. No risks, no commitment. As soon as there's commitment, there's going to be some element of risk. But if it's an intelligent risk, means it comes a faith that follows reason. So Moses was considered a person who was an ultimate person of faith and the ultimate mind, and there were no contradiction. So it says that Moses was the humblest man that walked on earth. The word is anav. And what is a humble anav? There's another word in Hebrew, it's called shuffle. The difference between anav, a humble person, and a shuffle, I mean in simple English, anav is a humble person, a shuffle is a person of low self-esteem. Or in different terms, humility, true humility comes from strength. Shuffle, low self-esteem, comes from weakness. Humility is often confused with weakness. But the truly humble person is the strongest of all. He's secure enough, or she's secure enough, to be able to be humble. Doesn't always have to be heard, doesn't always have to be pronounced, and is completely fine. A shuffle is someone who has low self-esteem, doesn't feel they're worth anything. A humble person knows his or her value, knows that they're indispensable, knows that they have qualities. Moses knew of his strengths, he was no pushover. But this is the key to a humble person. He never thought that his strengths are his own. He knew they were a gift. And he said to himself that if someone else was given this gift, they would have done better than I. That's a true man of power. Because he has the powers, and he never takes himself that seriously. And that's the hardest of all things. So when a person is consumed with fire, when a person is passionate, someone that's mediocre people don't usually cause too much damage. They cause mediocre damage. Passionate and powerful, fiery people can cause a lot of damage, like fire. So a fiery, passionate person with a rebellious spirit, with fervor, with zeal, with all the intensity, a person like that can go two ways. They can be very destructive. They can be very powerful and very constructive. But the secret key to that type of person is humility. Is the only counterforce to their passion. Because if there's passion, they'll say in the name of passion, everything is justified. I'm a passionate person. And the fact that some people are going to be stepped on, or some people are going to be hurt or damaged, too bad. This is the price you pay for my passion. Humility is the counterforce to passion. So naturally, passion will happen naturally what will happen to the children of Aaron, to the other three sages. They get burned out by their own passion. They destroy themselves with their passion. As all those men I mentioned earlier, the guys who burned out, whatever it was. It is, Rabbi Akiva knew the secret of Shalom, of entering in peace, entering with humility. He realized, I'm going into a place, it's not about me. He wasn't excited. The children of Aaron were too excited about it. You think, what's wrong with being excited about having a divine experience? Wow, that's unbelievable. They weren't excited about some type of selfish material experience, about making money, or about something. They were excited about it, but their excitement was their undoing, because I'm there. Are you? Then you cannot see me and live. Moses was able to shed the eye, and Rabbi Akiva was able to shed the eye, and let the experience emerge. And if I have the gift to be able to be there, I feel honored. But it's not about me experiencing ecstasy. It's not about me experiencing love. I am now a man or a woman that has seen the truth. The eye has to get out of there. Once the eye gets out of there, then matter does not get consumed. And that's what Moses recognized. When he saw the burning bush, he saw it wasn't being consumed. So his eye was very intrigued. He went closer to see it. And then what happened was, suddenly God's voice emerged. And Moses recognized, and he stopped, and he said, I am here. I'm present. I am here, not about me. I'm here to serve. Hineni. I'm here for you. And as a result of that, God says to Moses, this is sacred ground. And Moses takes off his shoes. So that's a sense of humility. Had he not taken off his shoes, had he just continued marching in, then he would have been consumed and the bush would have been consumed. And Moses understood that, and he took off his shoes, and that's when he covers his face. He doesn't want to see. That is the true humble person. It says in the sages say, interesting statement, they say, a person who pursues honor, the honor will elude you. A person who escapes honor, the honor pursues you. That's what it says. Kol habarech min hakoved, hakoved barech acharav. Kol habarech el hakoved, hakoved barech. Now, someone who pursues honor, the honor eludes him, is because it's not real. But somebody who wants to go the other direction, doesn't want the honor pursues you. Now, it doesn't mean to run away from honor and look over your shoulder if it's pursuing you, obviously. That's not exactly the way it's supposed to be. So it's a truly humble person who takes something higher than himself, more seriously than himself. And that's the secret of the burning bush. The secret of real success. Now, it's not easy. Because as I said, we live in a society we're not trained like this. This requires true reprogramming. We are trained to be as great as we can become. Now, this doesn't sound bad, right? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being the best you can be? Actualizing your potential. What's wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that, except one thing. It will die with you. Because it's only as powerful as you are. Interesting elevator experience. When you are dedicated to yourself, as great as you are, there's a limit. When you're dedicated to a cause greater than yourself, then you become an extension of that cause. When you're dedicated to eternity, you become an extension of eternity. So how does one achieve that? That everybody pursues the fountain of youth, paradise. We want immortality. In different ways. Some do it through cryogenic freezing. The pharaohs of old try to lock themselves in their pyramids with their brides. Yeah, they all died. And maybe there's some memories of some of their technologies and their teachings. But eternity belongs to the domain only of those that don't allow themselves to get in the way. And that's the art that we have to master. It's the art of listening, is the art of emerging, is the art of suspending part of yourself to allow something greater to emerge. This is the real secret of love. It would be nice if we could teach this to our children, so we don't have to start working backwards when we get turn into adults and start trying to figure out how to build healthy, loving relationships. Because the fact is, we have been programmed to think love is just another commodity. Yes, it's of course a little more complicated and more subtle than buying a loaf of bread, but it's a commodity that we have to find a way to conquer, to own, to possess. And people are struggling and desperate in relationships, trying to find control. What happens if you discover that love can't be controlled? What happens is only when you give up control is when it actually becomes yours. That's pretty terrifying for some people, for many of us, because we don't like to think that way. Control means I can control. It means I can turn it on when I want, I can turn it off. Moses understood the secret. You give up control, that's when you get real control. And there's no tricks. There's no way to fake it. You cannot fake God. You cannot fake truth, and you cannot fake true love. It emerges to those that allow it to who suspend their self-interest and allow it to emerge in their lives. So there are many, many lessons that we can derive from this story of the burning bush. Both in the context of being passionate and at the same time coexisting with others. It's only possible if your passion becomes an agent of some higher cause. If it's your passion about your interests, it has to end up hurting somebody. There's no way around it. It may not be today, it'll be tomorrow, because there's going to be conflicts. If it's a passion that's not about you alone, then there's room. If someone was, I was recently counseling a couple who definitely loved each other, but they came to an impasse, they came to a point where they just were simply unable to coexist. And their interests were, in many ways it was clear to me that they were meant to be with each other. There wasn't no doubt, there was no mistake here. But they screwed up. They screwed up a lot of things, and then you start the vicious cycle to a point where it's very difficult to repair. Like any little infection, it begins to fester and fester until a point where it's hard to repair. And I remember when we were sitting and speaking, and I said to them, you're both so passionate about your opinions, and you may be both right even. But one thing I don't hear, you're not passionate about your relationship, you're passionate about your opinion. Maybe if one of you or both of you would be passionate about your connection with each other, then you'd figure out how to maintain this connection. All this passion you're doing is becoming a passion about my understanding of it, my interest. So I said, it may be correct, but that's not the ingredients of a relationship. So I remember he says to me, the guy said, but if my interests are not being met, then how am I going to be in this relationship? I don't want to give up my interests. And it was very hard for me to explain, and I wasn't able to, at that point at least, to explain. I said, what you're saying is a contradiction. What do you want? You want your interests, and you want a relationship with another person who has other interests. How exactly is that going to work? So he says, well, that's why we came to you. So I said, okay, so if you came to me, let me tell you how it works. For now, get all your interests off the table. Figure out how you two, the interest is only one, how you two should be together in a kind way. Get all the interests off the table, period. And then you'll get your interests satisfied. But if you're going to begin and end there, it's over. There's nothing to talk about, because you have interests, and so does she. And that's simple as that. Why should she give up her interests? Because you're not ready to give up yours. So how are we going to deal with this? Who's going to win? How you has to win? But that's what happens. You get trapped in that mentality that it's either me or you, or compromise. But the commitment to say, 1 second, maybe there's a third entity here that's invisible. What we at a chuppah, at a wedding ceremony, you have the hovering third invisible ingredient called God. Maybe the passion should be, what does God want from this? What do we call the transcendent element in this relationship that is not you and not her? That is more than the sum of the parts. What do you want to build together? When you start focusing on that doesn't mean you don't get your interests and needs met, because then it comes back to you. Because once you have that bond, then the interests will be met. When someone loves somebody, they go out of their way to satisfy them. They go out of their way to help them. But if it becomes you versus me, why would I go out of my way to help you? You want what you want, I want what I want, and that's where we get stuck. Now I know it's easier said than done. What I said makes sense on paper. But whenever you're in the emotional state, you don't feel that. You don't feel that. And at that moment, you're blinded. And you can't see what the other person's saying. You can't see what you're saying, really. And essentially, that's where most problems begin and end. Now, of course, when you enter into a relationship with a sense of suspension of self, and you see, I keep reiterating, I don't mean annihilation of self. I'm not talking about compromising yourself. I'm talking about suspension in order to gain something greater. A simple example would be listening. You want to learn something new, you have to listen. Why? Because if you don't listen, you're going to only know what you knew till now. So the smarter you are, the more you have to listen, because you have so much wisdom up till now. You want to hear something new, you need to listen. Now listening means suspending your intelligence. It means suspending your processing, suspending all your analysis. Because if you don't suspend it, then it's just you again trying to understand and listening to another person share something that maybe you haven't heard before. It's not easy for an intelligent person to do. Because the more you know, and the more confident you are in your tools, the less patience and restraint you have to really open up to another person. But without that, there's no growth. So essentially, that's called suspension of self. You suspend where you are right now in order to absorb something bigger, and then you become, and you can bring yourself back into it. That's the key. And that's what Moses understood, and that's what Rabbi Akiva understood. And that's what hopefully each of us here understands. So, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have your passion and your fires, and actually not only have it, but it can become even more intense, because you know that it will not hurt. On the contrary, it will make people grow. So Rabbi Akiva, after he came out of the orchard, he only improved his and everybody's life around him. And he had a student called Rab Shimon Bar Yochai who learned from his teacher and had a similar experience. For 12 years he had to hide in a cave from the Romans, who were decreed that he should be killed because of his teaching, his studying and teaching of Torah. So he hid in a cave. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, the story of Lag BaOmer, we go to Israel after Passover, Lag BaOmer, the pilgrimage is up north, Rab Shimon Bar Yochai's grave in the city of Meron. So, Rabbi Akiva's student, so after 12 years, you can imagine that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar were so refined and so separate from civilization, they were extremely, extremely lofty state. And the Talmud tells us, it's a fascinating story, that wherever they would go, after they came back, after the decree was over or the emperor died, they were able to come back home. And they came back to civilization and they saw the pettiness, the superficiality, the plain greed and foolishness of people. It says whatever Rav Shimon Bar Yochai looked at began to burn. Yet again, burning. Began to burn. Whether physically or figuratively. So God says to him, no, that's not the way. That's not the path of the Torah. The path of the Torah is its paths are paths of pleasantness, and all its roads are roads of peace. Like Rabbi Akiva, you go back one more year, a 13th bar mitzvah year. God sent him back, not because of the decree. You go back one more year and develop the maturity, the spiritual maturity, that you control your fires. When you come back after 13 years, after the 13th year, wherever you go, instead of it burning, figure out ways to improve it, to repair it. And that's what happened. After the 13th year, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai developed that maturity, that whatever he saw that was petty, that seemed simple, superficial, he helped elevate it and repair it in some way. Now you would think the Rabbi Shimon after 12 years was a much more powerful person. Everything burned. Everything that was inferior burned. But that's not the way. It's far greater to have restraint and be able to, as I mentioned with the tzimtzum, be able to transmit a flow that elevates than one that destroys. So his eyes were very powerful, but what he burned, whatever he looked at was consumed. And to be a bush that does not consume, you can be a godly person and you don't kill yourself for infidels. But on the contrary, you figure out ways to elevate them. You figure out ways to inspire them. That's far more spiritual person than a person that burns everything around them. And each of us has many manifestations of this. In moments of passion, the things that you are most passionate or believe most, how much tolerance do you have when you are in that state? And that tolerance is direct proportion to how much humility you have. You have humility and passion, you have the secret to change the world. You have passion without humility, very powerful, but it can be very destructive. And of course, if you have humility without passion, then that speaks for itself. Then it's not going anywhere too much either. So you need to have all of it together. And like that girl that comes home from school, she gets a B+. Her father says, listen, either an A+ or an F. Anything but mediocre. Either excellence or complete failure. So, I wish you all, in this week of Shmos, where we begin the second book of the Torah, the book of Exodus, the book of Shmos, the book of Moses, where we start reading about the little child Moses growing into an adult. We all have a Moses within us, and we all have many burning bush opportunities. And the beauty is, Einstein said E equals mc squared. Matter and energy are reversible. Obviously, on a spiritual level, it means that matter and energy do not have to consume one another. They could coexist. And the burning bush, if you wanted to study of physics, the burning bush was matter that did not become consumed. Matter that became energy, and matter remained matter. That would be an interesting fusion, which Judaism, Jewish thought, always believed that's what the ultimate goal would be. That we don't have to annihilate or destroy an apocalypse of this material universe, that the world of matter, the material universe, can become a body of energy. Actually, it is energy, except it's concealed energy. So when we use our tables and our chairs and our food and our work and everything that we are, all the material part of our corner of the world, and we use it for spiritual purposes, we essentially are converting matter into energy without the matter being destroyed, with the matter itself becoming illuminating, like a bush that continues to burn, but it continues to remain a bush. So I wish this upon all of us, to find it in our own relationships, to find that passionate, romantic relationship with another human being. We two individuals can become a whole, an entity that is more than the sum of the parts, and find it also in our own, in all the different ways that this manifests in our daily lives. So with that being said, I conclude by wishing you all a very pleasant week. It's a real honor to share and speak with you all. And I want to just announce that Philip's class won't be taking place tomorrow night. It will resume next week. Those of you that have please leave your email address with us so we can remain in contact. And I hope to see you next week. No one should be consumed. Fires that burn, but without the consumption part. A nice blend of the two. So thank you very much.